Sometimes the world laughs at a man before it realizes he's the only one in the room with dignity. The whisper traveled through the marble hall of St. Augustine Church like a quiet current before a storm. Guests in tailored suits and glittering jewelry leaned toward one another, their voices low but sharp enough to cut through the still air. At the center aisle, cameras waited, reporters scribbled notes, and 100 curious eyes turned toward the altar where the strangest wedding anyone in the city had ever heard of was about to begin. A struggling single dad was marrying one of the most powerful billionaires in America. And she was arriving in a wheelchair. Ethan Walker stood beneath the tall stained-glass window behind the altar, sunlight pouring through shades of crimson and gold and landing across his shoulders like something heavier than light. His suit was simple, rented 2 days ago from a small shop 8 miles outside downtown, but it was pressed carefully and worn with quiet respect. Ethan didn't shift his feet. He didn't glance at the whispering crowd. His hands rested calmly in front of him, steady in the way only a man who had weathered hard seasons could be. Beside him, a small hand clung tightly to his fingers. Lily Walker, 8 years old, stood straight in a pale blue dress that still carried faint creases from its packaging. She looked up at her father with the serious patience children sometimes show when they know something important is happening even if they don't fully understand it. Around them, the murmurs grew sharper. Someone near the back chuckled under their breath. A man in an expensive charcoal suit leaned toward a companion and muttered, "A mechanic marrying Claire Kensington, that's the story of the decade." Another voice replied softly, "He must be getting paid a fortune." Ethan heard every word. He simply didn't answer them. The church doors opened with a slow creak that echoed across the polished wooden floor. Heads turned all at once. Claire Kensington appeared at the top of the aisle, seated in a sleek black wheelchair that reflected the light like polished glass. Even sitting down, she carried the unmistakable presence of someone who had spent years commanding boardrooms and headlines. Her ivory gown flowed over the chair's frame, elegant and controlled, like every other detail of her life. Yet her face held something quieter tonight. Something guarded. The man pushing the chair stopped halfway down the aisle as cameras lifted and flashes flickered like brief lightning. Ethan watched her approach without a trace of pity in his eyes. Not curiosity. Not calculation. Just attention. When Claire finally reached the front of the church, the room seemed to pause around her. The priest cleared his throat gently. The whispers faded, but the tension remained like a held breath stretching across the room. Lily tugged softly on Ethan's sleeve and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Daddy, are you sure she's okay?" Ethan glanced down at his daughter and gave a small, calm nod. Then he lifted his eyes back to Claire Kensington. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The billion-dollar empire watching from the pews expected awkward politeness. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe a transaction disguised as a ceremony. Instead Ethan stepped half a pace closer to her chair and said quietly, in a voice that carried farther than he intended, "You don't have to pretend to be strong today." Claire's fingers tightened slightly on the armrests. Across the room, a few guests exchanged puzzled looks. Because for the first time since the ceremony began, the billionaire everyone pitied wasn't looking at the crowd at all. She was looking only at the man standing in front of her. The church remained still after Ethan's quiet words, but silence did not mean peace. In the first few rows, executives from Kensington Holdings watched with measured expressions, their posture stiff and calculating. They had built empires on numbers, leverage, and timing. Weddings, to them, were rarely about love. They were about stability, reputation, control. Claire Kensington knew that better than anyone in the room. Her gaze stayed on Ethan a moment longer before drifting toward the tall windows lining the church walls. Sunlight filtered through the colored glass and spilled across the floor in long streaks of gold and crimson. Once, years ago, she would have admired a morning like this. Back then she had walked through boardrooms in heels that echoed with confidence across marble floors. Back then the world described her with words like brilliant, unstoppable, visionary. But life had a quiet way of changing the meaning of strength. 3 years earlier, long before this church and this strange ceremony, Claire Kensington had not known Ethan Walker even existed. Her life had been a carefully measured rhythm of meetings, flights, and decisions that moved markets by the billions. Her office sat 30 floors above downtown Chicago, where the skyline looked almost peaceful from that height. It was there that she learned how quickly power could become isolation. After the accident, everything changed in ways that numbers could not explain. Doctors spoke in cautious voices. Advisors spoke in strategic ones. Family members spoke in tones that sounded sympathetic but carried the quiet weight of expectation. The empire had to remain stable. The headlines had to remain controlled. And so the world gradually began to see Claire Kensington not as a leader but as a symbol. A billionaire in a wheelchair. A woman whose strength was now measured by what she had lost rather than what she still possessed. The board of directors never said it directly, but their concern grew louder each quarter. Investors were nervous. The press was relentless. Stability required an image the public could understand. Respectable. Traditional. Safe. That was when the idea of a marriage first appeared in conversation. Not a romance. Not a dream. A solution. Across the church aisle, Ethan Walker remained unaware of how many calculations had led to this moment. His life had never included skyscraper offices or boardroom negotiations. His world was smaller and far quieter. A small rental house 12 miles outside the city. A pickup truck with more miles on it than most people would tolerate. A kitchen table where a father and daughter ate pancakes on Saturday mornings while sunlight crept slowly across worn wooden floors. Ethan had not grown up with wealth or connections. He had grown up learning that respect came from how a person treated others when nobody important was watching. After his wife passed away several years earlier, that belief became the anchor that kept his world steady. Every morning began the same way. Coffee brewing before sunrise. Lunch packed for Lily. A short drive to school where she always hugged him twice before running through the doors with her backpack bouncing behind her. Then a long day of repairing engines, tightening bolts, solving problems that came with grease on his hands and patience in his voice. He did not think of himself as extraordinary. He simply believed in showing up for the people who depended on him. That belief was the only reason he had said yes when the lawyer first approached him 3 weeks ago with a proposal that sounded more like fiction than reality. Even now, standing inside a church filled with wealth and suspicion, Ethan Walker remained exactly what he had always been. A father holding his daughter's hand. A man listening more than he spoke. And a man who had quietly decided that if this strange agreement was meant to protect someone from standing alone in a room full of power, then he would stand there without apology. 3 weeks before the quiet tension inside the church, Ethan Walker had been standing beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights of a small auto repair garage on the edge of Oak Ridge. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and warm metal, and the early evening sun slid through the open bay door in long orange stripes across the concrete floor. Ethan wiped his hands slowly with a clean rag, finishing the last bolt on a pickup truck engine that had taken most of the afternoon to repair. Outside, traffic rolled past in a steady rhythm, tires humming against asphalt, the ordinary soundtrack of a town where nobody expected life to change overnight. Ethan did not know that his life was about to do exactly that. The bell above the office door chimed softly as someone stepped inside the garage. It was not the usual kind of visitor. Not a farmer asking about a worn transmission or a delivery driver needing a quick tire check. The man who entered wore a charcoal gray suit that looked far too expensive for a place with grease stains on the floor. He carried a leather folder under his arm and paused near the counter as if carefully studying the room before speaking. Ethan glanced up from the engine bay and gave a polite nod. "I will be with you in just a minute," he said calmly, setting the rag down and washing his hands at the small sink near the wall. The suited man waited without impatience. When Ethan approached the counter, the stranger introduced himself with measured courtesy. His name was Daniel Harper, an attorney representing Kensington Holdings. The name alone carried weight in any conversation about business, but inside a small garage it sounded almost unreal. Ethan listened quietly, his brow narrowing slightly, not out of suspicion but simple confusion. The lawyer opened the leather folder and slid a single document across the counter. What he explained next did not sound like something meant for a man who spent his days fixing engines. Kensington Holdings required a temporary public arrangement that would present stability to investors and calm the growing pressure surrounding Claire Kensington's leadership. The arrangement involved marriage. Not a romantic one, not a permanent one, but a legally structured partnership designed to restore public confidence in the company's future. The attorney spoke carefully, choosing each word as if he understood how strange the proposal sounded. Ethan did not interrupt him. Instead he leaned slightly against the counter, arms folded loosely, absorbing the explanation the way he approached most problems in life. One detail eventually made him lift his eyes and meet the lawyer's gaze directly. "Why me?" he asked in a quiet voice. Daniel Harper paused for a moment before answering honestly. Claire Kensington herself had requested someone outside the world of executives and investors. Someone who did not need her money, her reputation, or her influence to define who he was. During a recent charity event months earlier, Ethan had unknowingly helped Claire when she found herself struggling with a mechanical issue involving her driver's vehicle. He had fixed the problem without asking her name or accepting payment. That moment stayed with her. The lawyer closed the folder slowly and slid it back toward himself. "She believes you are a man who understands dignity," he said calmly. Ethan stood still for a long moment after the explanation ended. Through the open garage door he could see the evening sky fading into soft shades of purple and gold. In a few minutes he would need to pick up Lily from her neighbor's house. Dinner would be waiting at home. Pancakes had been her request that morning. Life was simple that way. Quiet, steady, honest. The lawyer finally asked the question that had brought him across the city. Would Ethan Walker consider entering into the agreement? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead he asked something unexpected. Is she being forced into this? Daniel Harper hesitated before replying. The pressure around her company is very real, he admitted. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more from that answer than the lawyer realized. He thought about a woman he had met only once for 10 minutes beside a stalled car. He remembered the way she had looked at the broken engine with determination instead of frustration. After a long moment of silence, Ethan Walker gave his answer. Not with excitement, not with fear, but with the same calm steadiness that guided every decision in his life. He said he would meet her first. Because no agreement about a future, even a temporary one, should ever begin without two people looking each other in the eye. The meeting took place 2 days later in a quiet conference room on the 32nd floor of Kensington Tower. From that height the city looked calm and distant, the traffic below reduced to small lines of motion gliding through sunlight. Ethan Walker stepped out of the elevator holding the same steady posture he carried everywhere else. His boots were clean, his shirt pressed carefully, but there was no attempt to disguise who he was. He was a mechanic who had taken the afternoon off work, and he walked into one of the most powerful buildings in the city as if he were entering any ordinary office. A receptionist directed him down a hallway lined with glass walls and soft gray carpet. At the end of the corridor a pair of doors stood slightly open. Daniel Harper waited inside beside a long table polished to a mirror shine. When Ethan entered, the lawyer nodded respectfully but said very little. Instead he stepped aside. Claire Kensington sat near the wide window overlooking the skyline, her wheelchair angled slightly toward the light. The city stretched behind her in long rows of steel and glass towers, but she looked smaller than the reputation that surrounded her name. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ethan closed the door quietly behind him and walked forward until he stood a few feet away. Claire studied him with a calm expression that revealed nothing easily. She had spent years reading people across conference tables, and she knew how to measure ambition within seconds. But the man standing in front of her did not carry the familiar signals of someone trying to impress her. His posture was relaxed. His eyes steady. He looked at her the way a person looks at another human being, not at a symbol or a headline. Claire broke the silence first. "You know why you are here," she said evenly. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling difficult conversations. Ethan nodded once. "Your lawyer explained the arrangement," he replied. Claire's gaze sharpened slightly. "And you still came." Ethan glanced briefly toward the window where sunlight reflected across the glass towers outside. "You said you wanted to meet first," he answered simply. The corner of Claire's mouth moved almost like the beginning of a smile, though it faded before fully forming. She had expected curiosity, maybe nervous excitement, maybe a man eager for opportunity. Instead she found something else entirely. Composure. Claire folded her hands in her lap and continued speaking. She explained the pressure surrounding her company, the restless investors, the endless speculation from the press. A stable public image could calm the storm long enough for her to regain control of the board's confidence. A marriage, even a temporary one, could change the story the world was telling about her. Ethan listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked a single question that shifted the room's quiet balance. "What do you want?" Claire's expression stilled. For a moment the confident executive disappeared and something more human appeared beneath the calm surface. She turned slightly toward the window again before answering. "What I want is irrelevant to the situation." Ethan shook his head gently. "It should not be," he said. The room fell silent again. Claire studied him more carefully now, as if recalculating everything she thought she understood about this man. Most people spoke to her with cautious admiration or careful strategy. Ethan Walker spoke with quiet honesty that did not seem interested in her wealth or reputation. Finally Claire exhaled softly. "What I want," she admitted, "is for the world to stop deciding my life before I do." Ethan nodded slowly as if the answer made perfect sense. "Then we start there," he said. Claire blinked once, surprised by the simplicity of the response. "You are not asking about the compensation," she observed. Ethan met her gaze calmly. "Money solves a lot of problems," he said. "But it does not solve loneliness." The words settled gently into the quiet room. For the first time since the conversation began, Claire Kensington looked at Ethan Walker not as a solution arranged by lawyers but as a man who might understand something far more complicated than business. And in that quiet moment, the strange agreement between them began to feel less like a transaction and more like the beginning of a question neither of them yet knew how to answer. The evening before the wedding arrived quietly, but the air around Kensington Tower carried a tension that even the city lights could not hide. Inside the building, the top floors remained active long after sunset. Advisors moved through hallways with folders tucked beneath their arms, assistants checked schedules one final time, and security staff quietly coordinated the arrival of guests who would attend the ceremony in the morning. To the outside world it looked like another carefully managed event in the life of a powerful company. But inside Claire Kensington's private office, the atmosphere felt very different. Claire sat near the window where the skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. The lights of Chicago shimmered across Lake Michigan like distant reflections of another world. Her wheelchair faced the city, though her thoughts seemed somewhere much further away. For days she had moved through interviews, announcements, and preparations with the calm precision that had once made her one of the most respected executives in the country. Yet tonight the silence around her felt heavier than usual. The engagement had begun as strategy. A simple solution to calm investors and steady a company that depended on her leadership. But the presence of Ethan Walker had quietly complicated something inside her she had not expected. His voice returned to her memory again and again. The way he spoke without calculation. The way he listened without judgment. The way he asked what she wanted when everyone else seemed more concerned with what she represented. Down on a quieter street 12 miles away, Ethan Walker sat at the kitchen table finishing a late cup of coffee while Lily carefully packed her small bag for the morning ceremony. She had insisted on bringing her favorite blue ribbon to wear in her hair because she believed special days deserved special colors. Ethan watched her with a faint smile that carried both pride and concern. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall, marking each passing second with steady patience. Life had always been about small moments like this. Making breakfast before school. Checking homework at the kitchen table. Fixing the leaky faucet that refused to stay quiet. Tomorrow would bring cameras and reporters and a crowd of people who measured life differently than he did. Ethan knew the world would see the wedding as a story about wealth and power. But for him the reason was simpler. He believed no one should have to face a room full of expectations alone. Lily zipped her bag and looked up at him with bright curiosity. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and considered the question. "A little," he admitted honestly. Lily nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. "That is okay," she said. "Sometimes brave people are nervous too." Ethan reached across the table and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Children often understood courage better than adults did. Across the city, Claire Kensington remained by the window long after the office floor had emptied. Finally she turned her wheelchair slowly toward her desk and opened a small drawer where an old photograph rested inside a silver frame. The picture showed her standing beside her father years earlier outside the first building their company had ever owned. She had been younger then, full of certainty and ambition. Her father had once told her that real leadership was not about controlling every outcome. It was about choosing the right people to stand beside you when the future felt uncertain. Claire studied the photograph for a long moment before closing the drawer gently. Tomorrow she would walk into a church filled with observers waiting to judge her life once again. But for the first time since the accident that had changed everything, she felt something different beneath the weight of expectation. Not fear. Not pressure. Something quieter. Something that sounded very much like hope. Morning light poured through the tall stained glass windows of St. Augustine Church, spreading colors of crimson and gold across the polished floor as guests filled every row of pews. The air carried the quiet hum of anticipation that follows powerful names wherever they go. Executives from Kensington Holdings sat near the front, their expressions carefully neutral, while reporters and photographers positioned themselves toward the back, hoping to capture the moment the world had been discussing for days. At the altar, Ethan Walker stood with the same calm posture he had carried his entire life. His suit was simple but carefully pressed, and beside him Lily held his hand with a mixture of excitement and seriousness that only children possess. She wore the blue ribbon she had chosen the night before, its color bright against the soft light pouring through the windows. When the church doors opened, every whisper stopped at once. Claire Kensington appeared at the end of the aisle, her white gown flowing gently over the frame of her wheelchair as sunlight traced a quiet outline around her. The driver who had brought her stepped back respectfully, allowing her to guide the chair forward on her own. The room watched closely, some with curiosity, others with doubt, and a few with the quiet calculation that had followed her career for years. Cameras lifted slowly, capturing each movement as she approached the altar. Ethan did not look at the cameras. He looked only at Claire. When she reached the front of the church, the priest welcomed the guests with a calm voice that echoed softly through the hall. The ceremony began with measured words about commitment and partnership, phrases chosen to sound both traditional and reassuring to the many observers gathered there. Yet beneath those formal words something else moved quietly through the moment. Lily glanced up at Claire with gentle curiosity, her eyes studying the woman who would soon become part of her life. After a moment she leaned closer to Ethan and whispered something that only he could hear. Ethan nodded softly, then looked back toward Claire with the same steady calm he had carried since the beginning of this unusual journey. When the priest reached the moment that required the couple to speak their vows, the entire room seemed to pause. Claire rested her hands lightly on the armrests of the wheelchair, her fingers tightening slightly as if she were steadying herself against something deeper than nerves. The priest asked if she accepted the promise of partnership standing before her. A long second passed. Then another. Guests shifted quietly in their seats. Somewhere near the back a camera lens clicked. Ethan did not move closer or farther away. He simply waited. Finally Claire lifted her gaze and looked directly at him. In that quiet exchange there were no investors, no reporters, no expectations from a billion-dollar company. There were only two people standing at the edge of a decision. Claire inhaled slowly and placed her hands more firmly against the armrests. For years the chair beneath her had been both support and symbol, a reminder of everything the world believed she could no longer do. But something about Ethan's steady presence made that belief feel smaller than it had ever been before. The room held its breath as Claire shifted forward slightly. At first the movement looked almost uncertain, like someone testing a step that had been forgotten. Then, slowly, she pressed her weight downward and rose from the chair. Gasps rippled through the church like a sudden wave of wind across water. Claire Kensington stood upright in the quiet center of the aisle, her hands steady at her sides as the room fell completely silent. For the first time in years, she was not defined by the chair behind her. She was simply standing. For a moment after Claire Kensington stood from the chair, the church held a silence so deep it seemed to absorb every sound in the room. The soft hum of cameras stopped. The whisper of fabric shifting in the pews faded away. Even the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows appeared still, as if the entire morning had paused to witness what no one had expected. Claire remained standing, her posture steady but quiet, her hands resting naturally at her sides as she looked directly at Ethan Walker. There was no dramatic gesture, no sudden announcement, only the simple undeniable truth of the moment. The chair behind her no longer defined the space where she stood. Across the front rows, executives from Kensington Holdings exchanged stunned glances. Investors who had arrived expecting a carefully managed display of corporate reassurance now found themselves witnessing something far more human than strategy. The priest blinked once, clearly surprised, before recovering his composure and continuing the ceremony with a calm voice that carried gently through the room. But everyone understood that the moment had already changed the meaning of the day. Ethan did not react with shock. Instead he stepped forward slowly, the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning guiding every movement. His eyes met Claire's with quiet understanding, not triumph, not amazement, simply respect. As if he had believed she could stand long before anyone else did. Lily watched from beside the altar with wide bright eyes. For a second she looked from Claire to her father and back again, then a small smile spread across her face as if the world had suddenly proven something she already suspected. Claire took one careful step forward. The movement was small, measured, but it carried a strength that filled the entire church. For years the world had described her life with headlines about loss and limitation. Yet in this moment none of those words seemed powerful enough to hold her. She stood because she had chosen to stand. Not for investors. Not for public opinion. But because the quiet faith of a man beside her had reminded her that courage sometimes begins with the smallest step. The priest gently repeated the question of commitment, his voice steady once more. Claire looked at Ethan again before answering, her words simple and clear. Yes. The response echoed softly through the church, followed by a wave of emotion that moved across the gathered guests like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ethan answered with the same calm certainty. When the priest completed the ceremony and declared them married, the silence that followed felt different from the one before. It was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with recognition. Claire turned slightly and glanced back at the wheelchair resting quietly behind her. For years it had represented the world's expectations of her future. Now it was only a chair. Nothing more. She took another step forward, this time with a confidence that carried the promise of many steps still to come. Outside the church the city continued moving through its ordinary rhythm. Cars passed through intersections. People walked along busy sidewalks. Yet inside the quiet hall something remarkable had happened without spectacle or noise. A man who believed in dignity had chosen to stand beside a woman the world had underestimated. And in the stillness that followed, Everyone present understood that the real power of the moment was not that Claire Kensington had stood up from the chair. The real power was that she had finally believed she could.